Good morning. I'm speaking to you on the day after the change of the guard in the United States. Joe Biden has now finally been inaugurated as president. In the normal course of events, I suppose this would be regarded as a very auspicious occasion, a time to look forward, time to time for hope, perhaps that perhaps the new administration may bestow positive benefits. However, as a conservative, and given the nature of the election, I have to say that the election result fills me with somewhat of a sense of foreboding. And I believe it is a significant, a very cataclysmic event in United States and in world history, because I think it means that the United States as a republic, as a free republic, has in fact fallen. It's necessary to make some comments about President Trump. I believe his legacy has been very positive. He's been a great achiever for the United States. He has commenced bringing industry back to that country. Most importantly, he's been a peacemaker. He's, I think, the first United States president elected since 1928 not to engage his country in a major foreign war. That's a very significant achievement. He also, of course, is a great deal maker and has brokered several very substantial peace initiatives in the Middle East. Um, Achievements that for any other president would, of course, have resulted in a Nobel Peace Prize, but because he's Donald Trump, that, of course, will never happen. Most importantly, he has been a champion of the ordinary working man and woman, the ordinary working American. He has stood foursquare behind them and against the elites who now attempt to control not just national but world governments. The loss of Donald Trump is a major blow to all people who respect freedom and to all people who respect democracy. His fall from office and the manner in which it was achieved is one of the great lessons of history, and I think one of the great tragedies of history. And before talking about the new administration, it's important to say a few words about the election and how it came about, what happened. Um, the evidence is very, very substantial, of course, that there was a significant chicanery involved in the United States election. That substantial evidence was presented by the Trump team. And many people say, well, look, that's all been adjudicated upon. The courts have found that that's not the case. But the reality is, no, the courts have not adjudicated on it. The courts refused to adjudicate upon it. How the Supreme Court and the new justice recused herself, of course, as I expected she would, because it appeared to me at her her confirmation hearing, that she is an expert at not giving straight answers to straight questions. But how the Supreme Court came to the conclusion that the several states who had brought actions against the election did not have standing in the matter, given that it was a federal election, is very, very strange and quite extraordinary. Um, I said before that the institutions of the United States did not work to stop the election being stolen. The American Republic is now in very, very serious trouble, and the institutions have not proven themselves to be robust enough to protect the country. Um, Apart from the evidence of downright cheating and the appearance of hundreds of thousands of votes in the middle of the night, apart from those elements of evidence, there is, of course, the substantial efforts made by the multinational corporations who control high technology and communications to weigh the election in favor of Donald Trump. And more of that later. It's now necessary to look at the incoming administration, and I think it is fair to say that what we see in America is now a socialist, if not a communist, regime, which is far more extreme than any of the socialist parties or socialist governments in Europe, such as Sweden or the Netherlands or Ireland. Um, Americans don't tend to do things by half. They tend to go full tilt, and their brand of socialism is riven with gender spite, with race hatred, with racism, downright racism, and of course with the curse of the modern world, intersectional politics and political correctness. So we are going to see very significant changes in the United States. not least of which will be a crackdown, as it is always called, on freedom of speech, something which has always characterized the United States. You could almost say the United States is defined by commitment to freedom, and that, of course, begins with freedom of speech. If you cannot express ideas, you cannot have democratic government of any kind. And that is going to come to an end in the United States. Um, the Democrats have been quite open about this. They're not pulling their punches. They've already commenced talk about deprogramming and de-radicalizing people who voted against them. Very, very sinister beginning. And let us hope that there will be some breaks on their power, but it's difficult to see where those are going to come from. Now, what does all this mean for the rest of the world? What does it mean for Ireland? Well, America, despite its carefully engineered economic decline, is still a major cultural player. What happens in American politics tends to be replicated in other countries, and Ireland is a classic example of that. So when you see the United States cracking down on the Christian religion because it's not sufficiently promoting of homosexuality, for example, or because it holds to the firmness and the indissolubility of marriage, for example, this will be classed as hate speech. This will be classed as a hateful attitude to have. A particular concern, of course, is the Catholic Church still, or at least a substantial number of its prelates, still oppose abortion, even though they're often very equivocal in their opposition. But abortion is essentially the sacrament of socialism, of the new Marxist religion. And the Catholic and other churches will not be long permitted to advocate against abortion. And that's going to emanate throughout the world. The pressure from the United States to promote abortion has been ongoing, particularly during the Obama administration. Aid was made conditional to many of the poor countries of Africa. It was made conditional on them rolling out a mass program of abortion against their own populations. We're going to see a great deal more of that. We're going to see, of course, attacks against organized religion generally, but also against families, against heterosexuality, and against men. There's going to be institutionalized discrimination against men in terms of business, in terms of employment. That's already been spoken about, even by Joe Biden, but also by some of the more radical elements in his party. It's important to bear in mind that many of the senior Democrats have very strong connections to communist organizations, have had for many, many years. And of course, they have very strong business connections, not just the Democrats, but many of the Republicans have very strong business connections with the Chinese government and with the Communist Party of China. I think the Communist Party of China is very, very happy with the result. They have somebody in the White House now who will represent their interests and who will continue the exportation of American business to China and continue to do business with China, despite the fact that it is a huge human rights abuser of its own people, of its own minorities, of Hong Kong. Very difficult to see who will now stand up for Hong Kong. I think the real loss, though, for the rest of the world is that there is no longer a champion of freedom. The United States is now controlled by a communist party in all but name. It is now a party which promotes repression of freedom of speech. It is a party which will attempt to undermine small business, which is the most dynamic sector of the economy. And there is nobody to look toward when we see repression being carried out in our own countries or in other countries. There was a time when pressure from the United States and sanctions from the United States could be brought to bear on a country which was abusing the rights of its own citizens. It's very hard to see how that will happen now. The United States is going to become a rogue state which abuses its own citizens. And it is certainly not going to interfere in other states doing exactly the same thing. The most dangerous impact will, of course, be freedom of speech. In the last election, apart altogether from the cheating of votes that took place, the impact that was made by the high-tech companies in terms of weighing the communications and the information that was given to people during the election in favor of their preferred candidate was very extreme. A high-tech executive who worked with one of the major companies in giving evidence to the Senate estimated that it was quite easy for, say, a company like Google, without it costing it any money, to direct up to 15 million votes to their preferred candidate. You have that kind of power being available to one side. It is very clear it's very difficult to run a free and fair election. Danton, at the time of the French Revolution, stated that without a free press, democracy essentially had no legitimacy. And the question is now, do we have a free press in the West? I think we've all witnessed, even over the last 2 weeks since the attack on the Capitol, the riots that were permitted to happen, of course. But since that, we've seen that being used as justification for huge numbers of what I would consider middle-of-the-road Facebook pages and YouTube channels being shadow banned. That's happened to our own, the Irish Freedom Party, that whereas before algorithms directed our speeches to people who had expressed an interest in it before, that is not happening. So we're no longer able to get to the audience that we had been able to get to before. We're a small organization in a small peripheral country. So you can imagine what it will be like for large organizations that might be able to make a difference. This is actually a very frightening prospect. The idea that multinational companies, private individuals, can direct elections, can interfere to an extent far in excess of anything that was suggested in terms of foreign interference, and that they can manipulate elections that easily. It's a very frightening prospect indeed. And it really suggests that the large high-tech companies should be broken up. They now have monopolistic power, and that has to be brought to an end. What does the future hold? Is it possible that the United States will come back? Many people think, well, look, if the Democrats do behave in this utterly appalling manner, what I'm suggesting, they will simply be voted out of office in 2 years' time or 4 years' time. But that's what people said about Cuba when the revolution took over there in 1959. Look, they will be voted out of office fairly soon. But of course, that is dependent on the existence of free and fair elections. The last election, I do not believe, was a free and fair election, and I don't think that the people who organised that are ever going to allow a free and fair election again. There will, of course, be a number of Republicans who will be allowed to be elected to create the impression that America continues as a free democracy. But in reality, I don't think that that is the case. So let us hope that the very, very substantial number of people, and there are a very substantial number of people who are wise to what is going on, probably a majority of American people voted for Trump, that was not reflected in the way the election was handled. And they may be able to combine. I suppose we can thank our stars that at least they have weapons, though they will not have them for very long more. They may be able to combine, and they may be able to bring some kind of a semblance of democracy back to the United States. If they do, then there is some hope that we will yet again see that wonderful beacon on the hill, that light to all the nations, which was the great Western democracy. We must continue to fight here in Ireland for freedom. The tendencies of which I spoke, the clamping down on freedom of speech, prosecuting people for having the wrong opinions, shadow banning people, denying people employment, open discrimination, promotion of racial hatred. These are all things that are happening in our country today. And they are at the core of the modern political project to promote a single world government with a single political ideology directed by the major superpower of China. It could be said that in many respects Trump was a, quote, mistake, unquote. He was not supposed to happen. In the last election, 2016, there was considerable evidence of cheating as well by the Democrat side, but they didn't do it sufficiently. They were not going to let Trump be elected a second time. And for the past 4 years, they have done everything possible to undermine his presidency and to undermine his legitimacy and to undermine the country's own democracy. Very worrying indeed. But we in Ireland must continue to fight. We must continue to fight for freedom. We still have some robust institutions. Whether our courts will be equal to the protection of our society and our democracy, we do not know. The lockdown is perhaps a prequel to what we will see in terms of increased social and political and religious suppression. And evidently, none of our institutions, certainly not our Dáil, certainly not our Parliament, certainly not our courts, have been equal to asking the serious questions that need to be asked about the whole lockdown process. So, with that, I would say that we must keep fighting in the sure knowledge that corrupt politics is always eventually undermined and is always eventually defeated. And we need only look to heroic people like Alexander Solzhenitsyn in Russia and what he went through. But eventually he did see his country coming out of the dark night of socialism. Perhaps the United States is only now entering that dark night, perhaps Ireland as well. But there will be relief from it. So with that element of hope, I would like to wish you a good morning. And I will pray for America. I pray for new administration. I wish that more of members of our church would also have a supernatural sense. I think they made a terrible mistake in abandoning our churches and in abandoning the Eucharist at the first sign of this lockdown, at the first sign of this pandemic. Wrongly so, without any evidence whatever to justify them. We did exactly the wrong things, but let us hope we can redress that. So I leave you with that. This is Michael Leahy of the Irish Freedom Party. Thank you.